Here's a drawing of the Naparima. So having gathered enough information in the research project and spent a lot of time thinking about how I would approach the build, it was time to start the construction of the model. The build actually started in October 2019 and finished in August 2020, some 11 months. During that time, I made 15 videos to record the build, which are on both YouTube and Vimeo. But just to refresh your memory, these are the original plans that I got from the National Maritime Museum in the UK. And this is my friend, architect John Otway, who very kindly offered to redraw the plans to 1/4-inch scale. The most important challenge was to work out how I would actually build the hull. My first thought was to build a plank-on-frame model, but because of the complexity of the tunnels at the stern, I felt that it would be much too difficult, so I decided instead to build a solid hull. Fortunately, the plans from the National Maritime Museum showed excellent cross-sections at each rib, which illustrated how the hulls changed over its length. So I printed out each section on the computer, mounted them on very thin plywood. This allowed me to lay out the hull and give me a feel for the challenges ahead. It also gave me a better understanding of the construction of the stern, which I had my fears about. There were 27 sections in total, and the 7 highlighted here in red were the main bulkheads. They were waterproof bulkheads. I decided to use mahogany to build the hull, which is a relatively soft wood and easy to shape. I cut out full blocks that made up the space between each of the ribs, working from the bow down to the stern. If there was no rail change between the rib sections, I simply made larger blocks. This became very challenging when it came to modeling the stern, however, as the bottom of the vessel raised up and no longer supported the base. To solve this issue, I added spacers where possible, which lifted the top of the section to the correct deck height. Perhaps the most difficult piece was the stern itself. As the size of the tunnels increased, I had to add support blocks, again making sure that the top deck lined up perfectly. The midsection was much easier, as there was very little change between the sections. As each section was completed, I temporarily put them together, again trying to keep a feel for a boat that I really didn't understand totally. Once all done, I laid the main deck template on the completed hull to establish the external lines and to make sure I had not made any errors. Eventually, I glued the sections together using PVA, clamping them with the largest clamp I had. The model ended up to be 35 inches, and I actually had to go out and buy a very large clamp. Now, as I flip the boat over, you can see the complexity of the stern tunnels. I then had to transfer all the lines back onto the glued up hull and started reshaping it to the final measurements. This proved to be quite challenging, but the use of auto body filler worked very well to cover up my mistakes. Measurements were taken off the cards that I had done previously. At the stern, I made up new cards by reversing the profile shape in certain sections to ensure that the shape followed the plan exactly. The process took lots of hours of work going back and forward and checking the final measurements against John's drawings and against the templates. But in the end, I got the shape perfectly done. Of course, the most challenging part still remained getting the tunnel shapes correct. But many of the imperfections of my work only became visible after I actually painted the hull. So you'll see a reapplication of filler back on the model. It was at this time I decided how I was going to display the vessel. And these are 1/4-inch brass rods that I threaded to support the model. And this is a method I've used for many of my models in the past. In hindsight, however, I should have used 1/4-inch stock, as the model ended up much heavier than I thought, and today it has a slight lisp. I made a decision not to show the rivet patterns on the hull, even though I had a perfect plan of it. Although it is slightly visible in the photographs, it would not have been noticeable at 1/4-inch scale. Now I completely painted the hull, and this was the ideal time to install the propellers. The supports for the shaft were made from brass tubes, which were soldered. In fact, this was installed much later in the build, which resulted in my damaging other parts of the completed model. So again, one of the lessons that I had throughout this build is I kept getting the timing wrong. We don't know the shape of the propellers, only their size. At some point in time, if I get to visit the wreck, these propellers will be changed to match the shape of the real propellers. During the build, I was constantly assembling completed parts to make sure that the model looked visually correct. This helped me greatly in understanding the build process. The next challenge was to fit the bow fairing. Because of the lack of vertical supports and the thinness of the plywood, which was cut to scale, this proved very difficult. The center bow piece was carved from wood. It also provided much needed support for the two sides of the fairings. Having said that, the block took 5 attempts before I got it correct. Fortunately for me, the vessel had a bumper rail around its side. So this helped cover the joint between the fairing and the hull and provided much needed support. We would normally use a template to bend the stern rail by my using a heat gun. Only then would I then stick the bent part on the model. In this case, because there were very little parts on the model, it was possible to heat the piece in place without damaging any other part on the model. The grill at the back was easy to make because I've made many of these grills and gratings in previous models. The installation of the pintles should have been done at this point in time. It was actually installed much later when most of the model was complete. Again, this stupid act of mine caused some more damage to the finished model, again stressing how important it is to get the build sequence right. In my defense, because it was a scratch build and I really didn't understand the model, you'll have to forgive me. I did add very large rivets to the rudder, as I felt that these were much bigger than the rivets on the hull and much more noticeable. Now that most of the hull was complete, I located the deck railing posts and the upper support posts. And this is where I made yet another mistake. By not measuring the exact drill depth of the main support posts, it became impossible to accurately locate and drill the 4 holes to accept the hand railing on both sides, simply because the depths were all different. The short rail post was purchased online and were perfectly in scale. One of the nice things about building at 1/4 inch scale is there's a lot of standard stock parts available online to purchase. For the 2 upper deck floors and the roof structure, I use spacers, which you'll see just on the right below the glue, to make sure that the deck beams were accurately placed. For the framing of the upper and roof decks, I use curved deck beams, which exactly mirror the curve of the lower deck. Once completed, I made up scale cabin blocks for both decks and started lining up the posts. The same thing was needed for the upper deck roof. To make sure that the deck boards completely lined up, I covered the holes to take the funnel and the cowl vents and cut them out later. There was a lot of adjusting as I planked the upper deck. Lining up resulted in many remakes of the framing. In the end, I decided to leave the side planking open on the roof deck so as to facilitate any adjustment as I went along. As I placed the posts and went through each deck, I realized the complexity of this operation. And this became yet another challenge, as in some cases, the posts came out right under a deck beam. When I tried to line up the main post against the railing, I realized how difficult it was going to be to get every hole to line up perfectly, not to mention how difficult it would be to even drill 4 perfectly aligned holes in each support post. I used a template to line them up and to locate the center of each hole that needed to be drilled in each post. The method I developed to drill these holes required my flattening an area where the holes were to be drilled. I then used an end mill, lubricating the surface with cutting fluid, which gave me a nice flat surface on one side of the post. Then I used a rounded bit to create an indentation in the flat space, as any type of punch would have bent the post. I could now drill the hole with little or no risk of error. Then I simply moved the post, still locked in the vise, to the next mark and repeated the same thing. Thankfully, all these holes line up perfectly. Incredibly, I was able to drill 80 such holes with only one drill bit because of the use of the cutting fluid. It was not possible to line up the drilling of all 4 holes in each post for the main and upper decks. So I cut off the tops of the main deck post and added a sleeve to the top to line up the base for the support of the upper deck post. This allowed it to be individually fitted on each deck. As a result, I was able to line up all the holes and drill them accurately. And here is a completed installation with the brass wire railing passing through the drill holes in the post. These are the sleeves installed, shown in red, and I was able to find brass pipe tubing just slightly bigger than the rod. Now, this is not reflected in the drawings, so this is the only way I could figure out how to do this. On the original photographs I had, the posts went right through both decks, sorry. So making the cabins and window doors proved to be quite difficult to figure out. This was my first attempt, and it was an absolute disaster. Then I thought I would make up individual doors and windows and stick them on to a plastic backing, and it really came out terrible. In the end, I decided to cut the windows out of flat plywood and scribe the lines for the door openings, the frames, and the window mullions. Then I fitted the wooden louvers as needed, or a solid piece. And then I used plexiglass at the back to give me the glass effect on the windows. Today, I would use mica instead of plexiglass. Mica is just so fantastic. Things that needed to be stuck out, like hinges and door handles, were added after, and most were made of brass. So you'll actually see that on the main deck, there were a lot of mistakes. By the time I reached the top deck, it really looked fantastic. I was able to locate 3D printed cowl vents online, which were exactly to scale. And then I added brass tubes for the intake pipes. These tubes fitted the 3D cowls perfectly. The funnel was completely scratch-built. I scratch-built the whistle and installed it on the funnel, and then, of course, painted the piece. I used different methods to make various parts. For instance, these bollards were made from wood and aluminum and are exactly to scale. Here's a detail of how the forward railing was attached to the bow fairing. And again, the fairing might have been, maybe I had 2/100ths of an inch on either side of the wire. Right now, it remains broken, caused by a timing issue. These parts should only have been placed before the railing was installed. The bow davit was found online along with the air scoop for the crew quarters. The capstan was also purchased online, as I found an exact match. So this is obviously a standard design that was used at the time, because there were quite a few options to buy online of the exact design that is shown in the plans. And the deck vents were also purchased online. I simply added the grill to the bottom and soldered it in place. What was more interesting, I made the stern davits for the lifeboats, including the tapering of the top to reflect the design that was shown in the plan. And this was done on a lathe. And then the various additions, the eyes and the cleats were soldered, and then it was painted. I'm not going to spend too much time on the boiler and the firebox. because as I sit here today, I'm still unsure of the final design. To get it to fit correctly, I would have had to have recessed the bottom of the engine room by 5 feet, so it would actually sit further down than you're seeing it here. This is my understanding of the shape and size of the firebox and the boiler today, but I'm still researching this detail on the ship. The main engine room and cabins were now complete. They were all made of plywood, carved and engraved with the accessories added. Here was a sliding block and tackle over the hatches that moved on a rail above the hatch opening, and it was used to raise and lower the cargo that was either dropped or removed by the little crane that is seen on the side. The external gates were soldered and then epoxied in place. Again, a problem of not being able to solder something onto the post that was already soldered itself, and it would have given me a lot of issues. And this is the one that caused most of the damage to the model. And I did attempt to install lights in the model late in the game, and of course it did not work out. I had to recess the space below the cabins to hold batteries, and I also had to drill holes between the engine room and the various cabins to pass the wires through. And then, of course, having got it all up and working, you'll see the bottom photograph, the lights are there, and it really looks great. I then burnt out all the lights, and that was the end of that. This is a 1-ton crane, which was soldered using the same brass tubing over with a solid brass post and painted, and these cranes did function once installed on the model. This is how I made up the throttle and gear levers, which were installed on each side of the ship's wheel. The completion of the upper deck housing, the main steps, and then the construction of some temporary long bench blocks. You will note that I have often made up and installed temporary pieces to understand the perspective of the model before making the actual part. The upper deck cabins were much easier to build and finish. They were all painted using an airbrush. And here is the completed main stair railing and finally the upper deck benches. The rear stairs required some interesting bending of the handrails. The steps were made of hardwood. The freshwater tank was gravity fed to the cabins and was located on the roof. There was no indication of how this upper roof was waterproofed, but I did find a reference that there were cases where there was a canvas coating that was sealed and painted. And to get the look of what I thought the roof might look like, I used emery paper instead of silk span. To make the benches, I resorted to 3D printing, and this is how the pieces looked when they came out of the printer. Then I made up a jig to assemble the benches. I tried many methods of trying to get the spacers right for the various pieces of wood on the bench, and this turned out to be the most effective way. And then one of the lessons I learned is when you're doing pieces like this, it's essential to make lots of extras, as errors are bound to creep in. And thank God, I think I made 7 extras and I have 1 left. And here's the finished wooden bench installed on the model. This was another jig used to assemble the long benches on the upper deck. This time I used a wire spacer to place the wood between the various pieces. And here is the bench installed and stuck, again using PVA. I use PVA to hold all the benches in place. Why? Simply because PVA, if I get it wrong, it's water-based and it's easy to clean up after. This is the plug I made to build the lifeboat, or gigs as it was referred to in the plan. And here is the keel. I used guava wood, which is very bendy and was available locally for the frames or the ribs. I also used a mold release agent to get the model out of the plug and to minimize damage. In the first one, the stern actually broke off. The second one came out perfectly. And here's the completed lifeboat. I'm not sure why I put this slide in. Maybe it's just to show you the order and discipline of my workshop. I use vinyl lettering to put the vessel's name on the bow and the stern. For the side steps, some of the parts were made of wood, while others were made by soldering brass pieces together. This is one of the 8 cable supports that tension the upper sides of the deck. I was not happy with the finish and will one day replace these. The stern light and other navigation lights were purchased online. And here we are soldering the stern deck frame for the canvas cover using the same size brass rods as the post. Installing the top canvas using silk span. Later, I added a side canvas to reflect a detail I noticed in the photographs. The life rings were purchased online as I found a perfect scale piece. But this is something that could easily be printed on a 3D printer. And as the build came to an end, we see the final rigging, the blocks, anchor ropes, anchors, and crew access to the lazarette at the front of the vessel. In terms of the case, I used mahogany to build the case since the boat was actually built of mahogany and I had lots of it. A key detail of the build was to add under the case to provide future owners with the provenance of the model. The same wood was also used for the framing of the case. And here is the completed case with a removable glass top that I can take it off and service the model when I need to. This is a close-up of the model, and this is the final model. Here's her resting place under my bar, surrounded by her family of Trinidad and Tobago vessels.